Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. As the Islamic Republic of Iran has been bracing for the retaliation promised by the Jerusalem government for the missile barrage launched at Israel roughly 2 weeks ago, the double question is, what exactly this counterattack will entail, and once it's over, how are the Iranians going to respond, knowing full well that further escalation would inevitably raise Israel's offensive bar to include targets such as Iran's nuclear and energy infrastructure. It may sound like an exercise in game theory, but it is very much the reality here in the Middle East. So to analyze these complexities involved, we are joined all the way from Washington, D.C. by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a Senior Director of the National Security Council in Washington, D.C., as well as a U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, currently the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. It's great to see you, Colonel. Also joining us elsewhere here in Israel is Colonel in Reserve Miri, a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University, who formerly served as a Senior IDF Intelligence Directorate Officer, as well as a Senior Advisor at the Prime Minister's Office. It's great to see you, Miri.
Always a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is ours. With us here in the studio is our TV7 Editor-at-Large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, we're all waiting for the anticipated strike. When? What? Where?
Well, we have a promise from the powers that be that it will wait until after this broadcast.
Okay.
But left to its own devices, and I don't mean beepers or walkie-talkies, Israel would have probably struck long ago, relatively, because it was on October the 1st, and as you said, 2 weeks have elapsed. But Israel is not completely free to choose the timing and method of this counterattack. Apparently, President Biden asked for and received a promise from Prime Minister Netanyahu that the target list will not include the nuclear infrastructure or the oil industry. And as for the timing, we are all aware of the approaching elections on November the 5th. And one method of delaying the Israeli response is sending the THAAD battery, the Terminal High Altitude Missile System, which is coming by increments. First, the test and some of the personnel, and then later on, and then you have to calibrate it and all of that. So this is putting off the response unless it's all a clever ruse to have the Iranians sleep at the wheel. So it will happen. This is not a matter of bookkeeping, it's a matter of strategy. Israel would probably need to get from the States interceptor missiles, which are running low. Israel has so many needs vis-a-vis missiles, rockets, drones, that it is best, even though it may produce some of it, to have an assured supply from the United States, along with other munitions. But eventually, it will happen.
Indeed. I did check with regard to the whole arsenal things. Of course, most of it is classified, so we'll leave it at that. But nonetheless, Israel does have enough to protect itself against the Iranians. Nevertheless, within complex realities and a fluid situation of warfare, you need to prepare for the worst, and therefore Israel is quote-unquote running low, but not necessarily if we portray it in reality. But nonetheless, I'd like to ask you, Colonel Rayburn, since naturally 3 weeks before the U.S. elections, November 5th is coming about, there are plenty of considerations in light of that, and Israel does not want to have some implication on the elections by its actions, not to be falsely accused of trying to tamper with the manner in which the current trajectory is taking place. But nonetheless, when we're looking at the broad scheme of things, what are the American concerns with regard to an Israeli retaliatory attack, leaving room, as Mr. Oren noted, for future attacks to raise the bar on the escalation ladder, but at the same time keeping within the equation that there are American considerations not only attached to the November 5th election?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I think concerning the Biden-Harris administration's approach to the current crisis, I think it's dominated by short-term considerations on their part. I think that they have a desire not to see an escalation of warfare across the Middle East that would look like a chaotic picture that then would redound to their detriment in the upcoming election and make it look like the current administration has presided over a descent into chaos. That's a short-term consideration. Now, they also have domestic U.S. political considerations with the Arab American and Muslim American community, which has tended to vote decisively for Democratic candidates, but that's sort of up in the air this year because of their discontent with President Biden, his approach to the Gaza conflict. However, that aside, I also think the Biden-Harris administration, I think the senior figures who are formulating and implementing the policy there also have a longer-term consideration, which is that if there is, if the current, if there's not a transition of party in the administration after this election, I think they still hold the idea that they can revive some sort of arrangement with the Iranian regime, some sort of return to something that looks like the JCPOA, a de-escalation agreement. I think they still don't want to close the door on that prospect. So they have an interest, I think, in trying to see a de-escalation, a diffusion of tensions. Let's say something that is not that won't decisively change the picture, so that the Iranian regime is not willing to enter into that kind of arrangement, say in 2025. I personally think that's highly unrealistic. I think that the deal itself is unrealistic, and the earth has moved under the Biden-Harris administration's feet in ways that they haven't adapted to yet. And I also think that that's not I think their view is not one that's shared, I think, largely across not just the DC political class, but also more broadly. I think, it's a moment. I think in DC there's a broader picture, there's a broader sense that there needs to be a reestablishment of deterrence and through pressure on the Iranian regime, or else that's what would lead to escalation. So it's an unclear picture right now, and it won't clear up until after whatever retaliation Israel is going to do against Iran and the shape of that, and also the outcome of the U.S. election.
Indeed. Colonel Eisen, you were in the Prime Minister's office, in the room, when, of course, Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Olmert, took the decision to strike at Syria's nuclear reactor. And within that context, you were also apprised to the whole dialogue between the Americans and the Israelis in that context. What can you tell us within this scheme currently preparing for a heavy retaliatory strike against Iran that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant highlighted? They will not know what hit them, how it hit them, and where it came from. Something that, of course, alludes to a lot more targets than just military installations at that moment in time.
The Syrian military and the Syrian nuclear quest were vastly different from the Islamic revolutionary regime of Iran's challenge for Israel right now. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard is out there. It is designated as a terror organization in itself. That's something official of the Islamic revolutionary regime, and it's designated in itself not as a rogue regime or something like that. It's designated specifically as a terror organization. So when you're talking about targets inside the Islamic regime of Iran, you have a very clear one: anything Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And that's something which is in acceptance. Because when we're talking about the attack in September of 2007, that at the time was a secret one, and it was only years later that Israel accepted responsibility for that, my main memory is the one of the Americans being told pretty much after fact. And that's not an easy conversation, not between prime minister and president. The after fact when the Turks were also told about it at the time, Erdogan, I mean, that's 2007. I have very strong memories of that aspect, because at the end, we're talking about what was at the time viewed as being something impossible. But the nuclear quest of the Islamic regime of Iran, as also Joel pointed out before, that's something that's been going on for a very long time. The world, as you were talking about, Jonathan, has been trying to deal with it for a very long time. And I say both the world and the United States and the international organizations, and none of them have managed to do anything about it. And the only ones that are directly threatened by that are Israel. We're the only ones. So when you ask both about the targeting and about what you decide, I look at the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I don't discount the fact that within that you can have nuclear sites. I don't discount that. I think that because it is an existential threat specifically only against Israel, not to anybody else, we actually have the understanding and the right to make a clear-cut decision that we know how to explain on why we are targeting whatever we decide to target. And I don't think that it is something that the United States, not under Biden, by the way, and not under whoever the next president will be, I don't think it's something they can impose on us. But Jonathan, you talked about one point before, which is the other vastly different aspect when it came to Israel very covertly attacking the Syrian nuclear capability. Hezbollah wasn't going to respond. The Houthis, the Hezbollah in Iraq, let alone what Syria itself had, none of them could respond. And in this case, we're talking about a response that the Islamic regime of Iran has been building in Hezbollah in Lebanon for the last decade and a half. They want to use that response. And I wonder, and I don't want to say worry, but we've done a lot of damage to Hezbollah over the last few weeks, but they're still holding back. And I think that when you do that decision on what you do and what you attack, and is it the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or isn't something, or nuclear, part of what we have to take into account is what's directly on the other side of our border, and not just what Iran will directly do against us.
Absolutely. Mr. Oren, with that being said, Abbas Araghchi had his tour in the region with, of course, the most important meeting from his perspective being in Doha, Qatar, as well as Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, during the course of which he signaled or messaged both the Saudis directly as well as the Americans indirectly that whoever allows the utilization of their airspace for a strike against Iran will be struck in kind, something that, of course, Israel is taking into the equation on the one hand, but on the other, it still needs to make its own considerations in this equation.
Well, there are many ways to get to Iran. You don't have to fly directly over the Arabian Peninsula or other countries. Israel has several branches, several special forces in various places. If you look at the geography of Iran, you can get there from Afghanistan, to name just one place, and let the Iranian imagination go further. They have, of course, a very long shore or several shores. So the Iranian threat, while obviously the various Gulf countries should hit it because they are vulnerable, is not going to force Israel's hand. By the way, the episode which you and Miri recounted from the American perspective had another aspect, that is North Korea. Right. For the US, especially Congress, this was even more important than Syria. And this is why in April of 2008, several months after the attack, the CIA went to Congress and briefed it openly regarding this so-called secret, which Israel tried to keep for several more years. The episode which comes to mind in what is happening now with the THAAD battery is 1991, when Israel had no air and missile defense, or at least missile defense, and the Patriot batteries, which the US and the Netherlands, I believe, sent to Israel, were conditioned on Israel accepting American guidance regarding the prevention of an Israeli counterattack into Western Iraq.
Well, Colonel Rayburn, when I look at the American posture in the region, we're looking at the USS Abraham Lincoln strike group. We're having, in the Fifth Fleet, that is, we're having the USS Truman strike group joining the Sixth Fleet on the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. We have the USS Wasp and the Bataan and many various vessels, additional squadrons, including an F-22 squadron or a couple of them, B-2 bombers, and a very sizable offensive firepower postured all surrounding this strip of territory. And my question is, if the Biden-Harris administration is not intending to utilize them, why spend all that finance in order to direct them into a offensive posture versus the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, I think, since taking office, January 2021, the Biden and Harris administration has been torn. They've had conflicting policies internally toward the Iranian regime axis of resistance. On the one hand, you have a forward-leaning military posture. I mean, you have to say, CENTCOM has been in a shooting war with the Houthis for many months and even longer, as well as in a shooting war with Iranian-sponsored militias in Iraq and Syria for quite some time. But on the other hand, on the diplomatic side, there has been there's been not an effort on the Biden team to match that military posture with a diplomatic isolation of the Iranians in the international community, in international organizations, international bodies, enforcement of UN Security Council resolutions, for example. And there's not been an effort by the Biden team to enforce the sanctions that are on the books in the U.S. to start to make war on the Iranian regime's cash. The revenue stream has continued to flow almost unimpeded, really, until a couple of days ago, on the Biden side, for the Iranian regime to then turn around and use that money to build to fund the war that it's fighting against CENTCOM. So it's been counterproductive. I think that the military posture that the U.S. has had under the current administration would have been sufficient, actually, to restore deterrence and to stop a lot of the nonsense that's happened over the last 3 years if it had been matched with commensurate political pressure and economic pressure, which has been absent. And probably, let's be honest, I think probably the prospects of an October 7th having happened, or the missile barrages against Israel, would have been much lower. Can I make an aside, though, about Iranian diplomacy? Abbas Araghchi, who is now, making statements and so on, no one has to really pay attention to those. And it goes to Miri's point. The Revolutionary Guards are the singular power in Tehran. They are the ones making the strategic decisions, albeit under the authorization of the supreme leader. There's an entire structure of the government and a diplomatic apparatus that is irrelevant and probably not even informed of these decisions. I think it was in September 2018, at the time of the UN General Assembly. I was walking down the street in Manhattan during the General Assembly, and I saw Abbas Araghchi walking down the street with a couple of Iranian colleagues, maybe 10 meters away from me, and I called out to him several times, Abbas, Abbas. And I saw him flinch and start to turn around, but realize it was me, and then very awkwardly pretend not to see me as he walked by. And I think it wasn't out of ideological reasons. I think Abbas Araghchi was the deputy foreign minister at the time. I think he was afraid to be seen making contact with me on the street because of the comeuppance that someone like that would have from the Revolutionary Guards, the intel, the actual power back in Tehran, if you were to go back. So he passed by me very awkwardly, and I've never forgotten that. That, I think, puts in perspective who actually calls the shots and who doesn't call the shots in Tehran.
What did he tell his colleagues? That you called for Abbas?
Not only that, I called for Abbas Arakchi. Abbas Arakchi. There could be no mistaking. He couldn't have thought there was another Abbas Arakchi on the street that I was calling out to.
Well, to take into account that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and even Kani, the head of the RGC Quds Force, was just in a week-long or 2 weeks of interrogations, such as, of course, the former president of Iran and others, for potential collaboration. The Iranians are obsessed with conspiracies. The RGC is terrified because it's known to be deeply penetrated not only by Israeli intelligence but by the Five Eyes and many other intelligence agencies who are keen to know whether or not the Iranians have made the decision to cross into that transition into the establishing or breakout for a nuclear weapon, something that the RGC, once more, by the directives of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, will make that decision and, of course, will pursue that nuclear weapon and be confronted by potentially yet another Israeli and hopefully also an American reaction alongside European coalition for that. But Colonel Eisen, I'd like to hear your take on this. What is Israel preparing for the day after the Israeli attack, considering the fact that the Iranians may be prone to attack back? Of course, it will come at an even higher cost the next time around, but naturally, Israel is not standing idly by.
It's not just about the direct Iranian response from Iran, which at the end will remind everybody is over 1,000 miles away from Israel, which means it gives a little bit of time and space for those cruise missiles, ICBMs, all the different capabilities they have. That's why we get, the 10 to 12 minute warning as opposed to the 30 seconds. So what do we do in response? I think that the Israeli action right now against Hezbollah in Lebanon is part of our preemption against what Iran can do. I think that in the fact that we are attacking right now, all of the different capabilities that Iran, the Islamic regime, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, stood in October of 2011 on the hill. Well, he actually didn't come up to the top of the hill. He was in the town of Bin Jbeil, and we had bets that day if he would have the guts to come up to the top of the hill that the Golani Brigade has been active in. They built there an Iranian garden. They built there a replica of the Golden Dome of the Rock, and that has all been destroyed in the last few weeks by Israeli troops. That is a preemptive action towards the Iranian expected reaction. It's taking out the capabilities that they supplied there. When it comes to their direct action against us, I'm worried, but when I say I'm worried, as you said before, Jonathan, I'm worried, but we have the capability. For that one, I want to see the U.S. troops in the area. That's a lot about the different type of interceptors. When Iran, if does retaliate back with missiles, with UAVs, with the different type of platforms that it can do so, those have to fly over Saudi Arabia or Iraq and Jordan. That's already going to directly impact other countries in this arena. I want to hope that we still do have, this isn't about diplomacy, let's make peace. This is about diplomacy, let's all be on board together against the worst threat that there is right now, not just in the Middle East from my point of view, but to the world. So that to me, the Israeli response is definitely bringing together the local allies who are all threatened by any Iranian response, the U.S. being in the area, but also our preemptive actions that we're doing right now, both against Hezbollah in all of Lebanon, and quietly I've noted that there are all sorts of attacks that are happening in Syria that don't get as much coverage, but to me that's part of the preemptive, talking about what the Iranians can do after.
Closing statement of each of you, 1.5 sentences roughly. Go ahead, Colonel Rayburn.
Yeah, I think with all the attention on the Israel-Iran confrontation, don't lose sight of northern Syria. There are a lot of tensions. There's flare-ups on the Turkey-Syria border between Turkey on one side, Assad, the Iranians, the Russians on the other. and it's that's a flashpoint to keep an eye on.
Colonel Eisen?
We haven't mentioned Russia or China and their impact. When we're talking about the Iranian response, we have to look a bit broader because at the end, it's Iran that's exporting weapons to Russia, oil to China. Let's not forget them with everything else going on.
A very important point, since the Russians have, of course, deployed their electronic warfare in Iran. The Chinese have just announced the deployment of a counter-drone system in Iran. They are very much involved.
Well, the Iranians, of course, are not averse to killing Israelis. From their perspective, the more the better. But they don't want their fingerprints on it. They are for the indirect approach for all the others killing Israelis. And we were used to maximum pressure. They wanted to use minimum force against Israel, hoping that no Israeli civilian will be killed, because they knew that killing many Israelis would give Israel the justification for a massive attack against them.
Indeed. Well, hoping, not hoping, rest assured that 10 million supporters of this regime were hoping for as many as possible Israeli casualties, irrespective of the fears of the regime itself. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Colonel Rayburn, Colonel Eisen, and Mr. Oren for all of your insights. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition, from here in Jerusalem, Shalom.